the presentation today is called, Preservation at the Crossroads. And really this kind of came about because of, what's going on in our community, the Corona Depot. That was kind of the impetus for this. And I started looking around the city, and I was talking to a person that maybe hadn't been here all that long, and they said, well, there really isn't anything historic in Corona. And I said, there's a lot. He said, yeah, but you guys have all torn it all down. Yes, we have torn down the city, and I say we because as the royal we have destroyed a lot of history in the city, but there is still a lot of history left. So I want to go back and kind of talk a little bit about some of the buildings that are gone, some of the buildings that have been changed or morphed a little bit, and some of the buildings that are still here that deserve some attention. Having a rich history and having historical buildings that have character, that have experiences to lots of people, is really, really important. So it kind of bridges that gap between history and nostalgia. The first thing I want to do is basically strip malls. So what you see on the left is a strip mall that's right at the corner of Grand and 6th Street. When I was a kid, it was an AutoZone. It became a couple different things, and now it's an insurance agent that's been there now for a while. Now, that had several different businesses in it. It was built for that. Now, the Corona Theater building on the right was built for the same thing. It was, the theater was the main portion, but more of the square footage in that building was for other uses. There was the gas company, there were attorneys that were upstairs, there were insurance agents. So literally the same, and I think there even was an auto parts place that was in there for a very short period of time. But the difference is that in the 1920s, that's what a strip mall looked like. And in the 1980s, 50 years apart, that's what they look like now. So, I talked a little bit about this, that, we really are at a crossroads, I think, because development pressures, there's always been development pressures, but I would say in the last 50 years, the development pressure was urban sprawl. So to go out into the community and build where there's nothing. The state has made that very expensive and very hard. Through CEQA, through the California Environmental Quality Act, through lots of things, they've made that very difficult. In fact, if you build away from the city center, you have to pay mitigation for people called vehicle miles traveled. So they're making it cheaper to develop in cities. So you're seeing, cities that are west of us they're seeing lots of pressure to take out historic buildings and build housing. I'm not saying housing isn't needed, but we need to be selective and how we do this, some protect things. So, I talked a little bit about the Corona Depot. This is the second depot. It was built in 1931, and it will meet its demise, this year, probably around this year. We were unsuccessful in trying to get in all lumber. They were the owners of the building at the time to not tear it down, to maybe give us a little more time, but unfortunately the money always plays out. And frankly, when I talk to people and you saw presentations online, people would say, but it's historic, but it's on the National Register, which it's not, but it is eligible. That's not a check mark anymore. That's a great thing to have. Those are all good things, but the city's code needs to be changed, because right now, the way it reads, there's 7 different criteria, and the most important criteria is that the owner cannot get all of their economic benefit from the property. They can demolish anything. That means that building on the right, if the right circumstance happened, could be torn down. And so there needs to be a change, and I'm proposing that to the city council now. It should come in front of the council here in the next month or so. And toward the end of this presentation, I'm going to kind of ask for your help a little bit, but I want to talk a bit about that. So the other side, the Silver Dollar Pancake House, started in 1936 as the Copper Kettle, became Lindy's in 1949, and did this, this great addition that you see primarily. If you walk into the building, you'll see kind of 2 pieces. Welcome. You'll see, 2 parts. One is kind of the diner area, and then you'll see kind of a more seated area. That seated area was actually the original building from 1936. In fact, if you look at an aerial photograph, you'll see a spine of a building that's there, And if you walk on the gas station side, you will actually see rafters that come out at an angle, and they look completely different. Very unique, very interesting. And so in 1949 it was changed, was added on to, and then in 1962 it became the Silver Dollar. So lots of, from the state side, I talked a bit about that. There are current bills, SB 79, which will take away, like we were able to under SB 9. SB 9 basically did away with single family zoning, but we were able to get a caveat put in that if it was in a historic district, in a historic area, that you couldn't, tear something down without going through CEQA. Well, the newest bill, this SB 79 that's going through the legislature right now, will basically take away that designation and only be for properties that are landmark properties, and we don't have very many. Like to get a lot more listed, and we made it a lot easier. We made some changes to our code to make that a lot easier, and again, something else I'm going to ask you to help with. I normally don't like to do the whole depressing part of, we talk about the things that aren't here anymore, but I think you need to tell a little bit of a story before you get there. So the Hotel Temescal was basically at the southwest corner, so where the library is now, basically, well, let's see. That's the idea of where it would be. It actually would be in the middle of the street, because remember, Main Street was realigned. But it was a pretty impressive building. You think about it, if you look in the background, there's nothing there. I mean, nothing. This is 1887, the city was less than a year old, and they started building this building. So when you came to town to buy something, they put you up in this hotel and tried to get you the idea that it was an amazing place. And I mean, if you think about it, it's completely empty. Another good picture of the building, that it's pretty much finished. It's pretty new. You can tell two things. One, because of the vegetation so small, but if you look around, there's nothing around. So we're looking kind of to the southwest. So you have the Santa Ana Mountains behind you, and there is one. You have a couple little buildings. And how I could tell this was basically between 1887 and 1891, not just because of the plants, but because of this map. So if one of the reasons I could tell that picture from before is from this time frame is if you look at the building, you'll see these little servants' room on the bottom there, and the laundry. And if you go back and look at that picture, you can see there's the servants' quarters here. Servants' quarters. So, and those maps were done. The Sanborn Company they were an insurance company, and they did amazing detail, even down to like what the building was made out of. This is really for fire reasons, because things burned down a lot. In fact, this building did burn down in 1899 after it was moved, and they forgot to check the fireplace. So there was a crack in the fireplace, and they lit the fire and actually burned the building down. But I kind of like this picture just because it's an old postcard, not a great one. It was a little faded, but you can really see some of the detail on the really Victorian looking. The other two photos, it's done, but there's they're not all flourishes, but it was described as being very Victorian at the time. And kind of the building that fostered this organization was the loss of the Carnegie Library. It was classic revival. The architect was Franklin Pierce Burnham, and it's funny in the notes it says that this was the only surviving classical revival style, but there were others. Well, they were the only classical style. There are ones that did not survive that I'll talk a little bit about later. But and this is the evidence. This was built in 1906, almost entirely from a grant or a donation by Andrew Carnegie, that he built these all over the place. It was a beautiful building. It had a rotunda, a child's reading room, even though it says on the right, but it was on the bottom floor. I did have some pictures of the inside of the building, but they're quite kind of depressing. This is so dark down there. They didn't have any, I haven't found any of the rotunda. I think it would be really pretty, but this is evidence basically that this was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1977, and the city still tore it down in 1978. And you can't share a picture of a library without being covered in snow. This is from 1949, a picture by Rudy Ramos that's that 1949 time frame, that snow was pretty prolific, and there's lots of great pictures of different parts of the city covered in snow, but I always thought it was pretty, romantic looking. And then the destruction, the demolition of the building, and I would say that it happened in 1978, and most folks that live within a few blocks of there have the bricks from this building probably in their backyard. They've made patios out of them. I've heard many stories of thank you that we were able to reuse them and use them on part of their patios. So the building is, even though it's down, I think pieces of it have stayed. So I wanted to give a little bit of love to some of the older buildings. The one on the top right is the Cruz block. It was Jose Cruz. He built it in 1895. And I say 1969 because the building never was really torn down. It was maybe altered, the facades were changed, but the buildings were there. And Jose was a entrepreneur. He built the buildings. He had a bakery and a confectionery, and then he built the theater next door. And they were, but it kind of typifies the 50 by 100 or 25 by 100 foot, sections that the city was built in. And this was located on the east side of Main Street, just below 4th. And the theater went through a couple different iterations, or 3 different iterations that I could find, probably a couple of others, but the Del Teatro was the first one. I can't tell exactly when it stopped because they didn't always, there was a Spanish language portion of the newspaper that they would publish very small, very small. But it was all in Spanish, and it usually featured, what movies that were going to be in that theater. And sometimes they were in English as well. The last one I could find before it kind of went away was the El Teatro de Circle de Corona, it shows all Spanish language newspaper. And then if you look at the other side here, this is Main Street looking north. So you see that's, or let's see, depending on what time frame, that's either Beacon Hill in Norco or Chocolate Drop Hill in Norco, depending on when you got here. But you can kind of tell the construction. I know I've heard a lot of folks that were telling me you can't have 3-story buildings downtown. Well, this is a 3-story building before there was even pavement. So we've had 3-story buildings downtown, we've had apartments downtown, all kinds of other fun things that have been there for a long time. And if you look in this lower picture here, you'll see the Witch's Hat Cupola. That was at 6th and Main. That's in the First National Bank building. It was one of the very first buildings that were built here in the city. And speaking of that, that's this building. It was started in 1887. They finished the first floor, and then they immediately started on the second floor. That building, I don't give a date because I know it was updated sometime in the 1940s or 1930s. They changed the facade. But the building, was still there. In fact, there was a couple of articles about people were complaining that they just put a new face on it. They didn't change any of the outside of the building. I want to talk a little bit about the schools, even though I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But some really great some great schools here. First, the first Corona High School in 1907. If you look at Corona Junior High, you'll see a kind of an open area in the middle. So you'll see the original building that was done, I think in the 1948. That building was done, and then you'll see the other building was done sometime a little bit later. But that spot in the middle was where this building was. Talk about classic revival. It was pretty impressive, and kind of matched a few years later. I think it was definitely a inspiration for Leo Cronin when he designed the third City Hall building for the city of Corona at 8th and Main. And then Washington School, which was located on Grand, kind of just north of where the post office is. I mean, a beautiful building, architecturally a beautiful building, but if you look at aerial photographs, it was just a dirt lot behind. There was no place for kids to play. This is where if you were Hispanic or you were Italian and didn't speak English very well, this is where you went. And I heard that from many folks that went there, The building wasn't necessarily built all that well, and there were some places in the building, if you lean against the wall, they'd move. So it didn't really last all that long. But architecturally, it's a beautiful building, but it definitely gives that facade that you were taking care of everybody. And then on the right is Crossroads School, South Riverside School, later became Lincoln School, and that's where Victoria Park is now. There's kind of a big open field that was part of that building. They did take off the top story and the bell tower because it was seismically unsafe, and they used it for a cafeteria. They used it to prepare food. Interesting, the kids could eat there, but they couldn't learn there. I don't know why. That building was eventually demolished completely and replaced with the second Lincoln School, which part of it still remains at Victoria Park. Kind of an example of the typical downtown business. They were, 50 to 100 foot wide, or some of them were 25 feet, but these were right next to each other, 0 lot lines right next to each other. I think what was interesting about these two, one was on Main Street and one was on 6th Street. So being 613, it was just a couple of spots away from 6th and Main. Keller Furniture there, same thing, just 1 or 2 spots away from 6th and Main. The Stanfield Baking Company was in the Sovereign Building, and it's interesting when you go back and look at addresses, you can't find them because they talk about everything about a building. So there was the bank block, or the Sovereign Building, or the Taylor block, or so you had to really go back and try and figure out who it was. Occasionally they would sneak in an address, but it was a giant pain in the butt to try and figure out what the addresses were. But I thought it was quite interesting. And even though these buildings were built 7 years apart, they're very similar, and that was kind of indicative. So these things that are built 1890s, they have a certain look to them, a little more ornate. And you go back to that street shot of Corona looking north, that 3-story building, a little more decoration to it, not over the top, but that was probably 1890s, to 1900. And where Corona's kind of lagging behind a little bit, just like we were kind of off the beaten path for sure. But then as the buildings were built later on, you would see them streamline more. So the building on the right, the Keller Furniture Building, had a little more decoration to it. 1920s, kind of the arts and crafts, even though there's not a lot of wood in there. And then if you look at the 1930s building, there's not a lot of flourishes. The holes on top weren't decorative; they were for air conditioning, to have air move in and out of the building. And the most interesting part of the Stanfield Baking Company is that before it actually was built to be a mortuary, and it was a mortuary and furniture store because they all went together. If you were a mortician, you certainly needed caskets, and usually you owned both. So the front part of this building in 1891 was a furniture store, and the back part was a mortuary, which eventually became, after many acquisitions, Thomas Miller Mortuary, which they are the oldest Corona-based business. So they started in 1891 in that location right there. And then the Lord Building, this is built by Daniel Lord in 1900, and it stood basically at the corner of 7th and Main until urban renewal. Mr. Lord purchased the property in August of 1899. He purchased a lot of property, so trying to figure out, and they didn't really give street addresses or even sometimes streets. They just gave block numbers and lot numbers. So Kevin would go back and look at these plot maps to figure out, and he bought property all over the place. He was born in 1849. He lived until he was 66. He was a lifelong bachelor, had lots of health issues, spinal meningitis, I think in his 50s. He spent a lot of time in the hospital, came near death at least 3 times. And then 3 years before his death, he decided to marry. He met a woman in Los Angeles and decided to get married and came out. He also was shied away from publicity, even though he gave a lot of, was very philanthropic, but he also was a very big promoter of the city of Corona. In fact, it was described as him being a little bit manic. Sadly, in 1915, there was a little downturn in the economy. I think he owed a little bit. He had always been on his own. He'd been just married for a few years, and that morning had walked out of his office, walked down towards 6th Street, and kind of walked west to Washburn. And there was a old pepper tree that was there, and he walked over to the pepper tree, sat down, and shot himself. Missed the first time. He didn't, but he staying true to being a hardworking person at that time frame. He pulled his gun out and did it again, and this time he did not miss. His poor wife, she stayed around for a while, sold insurance in town, and sold most of his properties, though she did keep the bank or the building here for a while. Now, the top of this building, bottom part, was a bunch of different things over the years, and you can't see it in the picture, but this is Cotton Cafe. There's a little sign there. There was always a cafe. There was always some kind of a restaurant on the bottom floor, and probably dozens of them. The top floor, always apartments. They were offices. At one point, he had his office in the cupola part, the round part here, until his death, and then after that, it became apartment. In fact, there was many years after his death, one of the people that stayed in the apartment that turned into said that it was one of the best views in the city because it hung out and you could kind of see down Main Street. And then here's the building in 1969, right before it was torn down. You can kind of tell by even though the picture was undated, you can see by the cars that are pretty evident that's definitely in the 60s. But it looked, you don't see too many changes. Windows are the same. I think the one big difference is the post that comes down that kind of holds up the rotunda there part. They rounded off and made it more utilitarian. Of course, the windows changed. You have another entry there, and they have them more on the street, but that's about it. Okay, then the Corona City Hall is the third City Hall. The first City Hall was in a dance hall that they had on Main Street between 5th and 6th on the west side of town. There was a second floor that was a dance hall, and they would have their meetings there. And they had a little office downstairs for some of the staff. I think they only had two paid employees. And then the city purchased the block between 7th and 8th Street on the east side of the street, and they built a small wooden city hall and what they called an aerodrome, which is basically an outdoor stage. And the city would either lease it or would rent it and have folks come in and do shows. And they had a lot of shows. I mean, I found a lot of advertisements for it. It was called the Aerodrome, which first I thought it was an aerodrome, and I thought, oh my gosh, there were planes here, but no, just called air because it was out in the open air. Though there was a theater right across the street that was in the basement of the back part of the lower building that you entered off of basically a set of plywood that was on the ground. You had to kind of walk, and when it rained, people couldn't get over there and they complained, but at least they weren't sitting outside. This building was designed by Leo Cronin. He was Corona's first architect, designed lots of cool buildings in town. But this is one of the ones that he really got inspiration, because we think about it, this corner, 8th and Main, you have across the street, you have the Baptist Church. Across 8th Street, you have the Carnegie Library. And it was quite impressive to look there, and just 2 blocks off of Main Street. It had a basement, and that basement held the fire department. There was an entrance there, an exit that led onto 8th Street. And we have some film from 1949 where it shows the trucks pulling out of that portion and going to a call. Also in there was the jail. And it's interesting that when they did urban renewal, they knocked all these buildings down. They found the entire basement. So when they were they were putting up the Starbucks at 8th and Main, Congressman Calvert and his partners said, yeah, we scraped the first layer of concrete or of asphalt, and then found an entire city hall, their basement, because they literally just pushed everything in on top of it and paved over it. So he had to spend quite a bit of money excavating everything, and in fact, gave us a brick and a piece of glass that we display sometimes. So, and then this picture is basically them tearing it apart. And, they moved into this building in 1962, and they went to work pretty fast. And from what I could tell in the newspaper, there wasn't a lot of nostalgia for the building at all. Some people talk fondly about either working in the building or, the first day it had gone in. In fact, the only articles I could find was, marveling with how fast they got the building down. It was pretty quick, and there was a gentleman that was running a D9 tractor after they had taken apart, big pieces of the building, and like 2 whole articles about this guy, how good he was at tearing things down. So definitely a different mindset. This is the Ice Depot. It was Ice Depot from 1929 to about 1931, and then became Corona Ice Service. And it was located at 114 7th Street. It kind of expanded. It would be on the East 2nd Street, so on the east side of the street. It was a gas station. They had, this gentleman, Mr. Kathy, Mr. Carroll, were, talk about entrepreneurs. They were into everything. You saw their name on all these different things. But their, kind of claim to fame was that, ice became a thing, and they figured out they could make it. And people needed ice for their ice boxes, but more importantly, without being able to make ice in an industrial way, they use it to ship lemons. So they would take out blocks of ice to put in these refrigerated cars, because they didn't have a way to refrigerate them except for to put ice in there. So they would produce these ice and they would load them on these trucks and go down there. At the same time, they had a ice storage, and I thought that was really strange. It's like, well, why would you have ice storage except for, for the packing houses? But it was really, people apparently here hunted a lot, and you couldn't fit all that meat in your little tiny ice box, and you didn't want to chance it. It would spoil. So people rented lockers, and they would rent a locker, and if they killed a deer or had beef or whatever, they would store it here so we could make sure it wouldn't spoil. They didn't want to miss out on anything. So they were pretty successful. In fact, so successful that Mayor Beholden at the time actually bought this ice storage, or this cold storage business from them. And then in 1953, they moved to their current location, which is over on Grand. But the door-to-door ice service was their big big claim to fame, and folks loved them for it. In fact, during the war, there were still folks that didn't have refrigerators, and you had to come down and get your own ice, because the gentlemen that were working there, they were all in the war. Yes, ma'am.
That's behind City Hall?
Yeah, so if that's right. Thank you for pointing that out, because I meant to say that. So if you look there, you'll see the building that's right behind it. That's City Hall. The back of City Hall. And then one of the buildings that don't get a lot of love is the B&R service building. It was on Chase. It was basically just east of what's now Rimpaw. And it was a facility that they did equipment repairs for the groves, so everything from pumps to trucks to all these different things. Really pretty. I figured out it was built somewhere around 1915. It survived until 1999, and I couldn't find any occupants in the last 20 years of its use. But it's a pretty neat building just from an architectural standpoint. It was, you had that poured concrete facade, and it was pretty neat. But I think one of the neat things about this building is, so when it was built, it was on Lemon Street and Leicester. And then when it was torn down, it was on Rimpaw and Chase. So they changed the name Chase to Ethan Allen Chase to honor him. It was Lemon Street, and they were confused. They didn't want to confuse, because there were Lemon Streets in Riverside, there was Lemon Streets in other places. They didn't want to confuse people. And the city council said, we would like to honor Mr. Chase by renaming the street for him. And he was the founder of Chase Ranch. So Chase Ranch was named after him. And then probably my favorite little building downtown was the J.C. Hoover Funeral Chapel that was right next to the Baptist Church. If you look at, I included the image on the right just because you can see how close it was to being demolished from the realignment of Main Street. It was a really cool building. It was built in 1896. I'm thinking I found some references to it as being, again, in the front was a furniture store, and in the back was the funeral home and the chapel. In fact, Mr. Hoover had bought up several furniture stores over time to pair up to make sure that he could make enough caskets. And eventually, in 1932, he was partnered up with Mr. Bell, and then Mr. Hoover retired, and then it became the Bell Thomas Mortuary, and then later on became Thomas Miller Mortuary. So they were in that building until I think it was around 1960, and then became a kindergarten for the school next door for the Baptist church. I don't know if they told the kids it was a funeral home before. Maybe they didn't figure it out. Let's see. This is the Oddfellows building. This is at 617 Main Street. This is on the east side. This is the earliest picture. I did find some later pictures that had kind of taken off the ornate part of the top. The Oddfellows, they were a fraternal order that came from England. They were really centered on trades folks. So if you were a tradesperson and there wasn't any work, you could go just to the nearest, go to the next town, and if they had an Oddfellows Hall, they would help put you to work. They also have, in the back east, they have a lot of cemeteries, so folks that couldn't bury them, didn't have any, they were indigent, or the Oddfellows would bury you as well. So they were, in Corona, they are still here. They're over on West Main, or West Grand, or West 6, sorry. They don't have not a large organization, but they were, their idea was they would, get some money together. They would start a corporation, a nonprofit corporation, and they would have to provide not just dues, but they were members of the corporation. So each year they had to pay. If they didn't make enough money, their idea was they would raise money, build a building, rent the bottom floors out, keep the meeting hall was on the second floor, and they would, if they didn't make enough money, they would have to basically ask for a dividend from, instead of paying a dividend, they would ask for a payment from their investors, and they did. They called them investors. But a really beautiful building, and I think this is another one that the pieces of the building stayed there until the 60s. Even though I think you probably couldn't have recognized it if you saw it. They showed a picture, but they definitely been altered over the years. Saw a few different pictures where the second floor is still there, but all the ornateness at the top is all gone. And so we talked a little bit about the depot earlier, and I'd say this is kind of how this building died. Most likely, death by 1,000 cuts is what I wrote in my notes. In 1971, when the Great Separation happened, it buried it. It struggled. It still was a viable location, but then the city had acquired the land around it when the Santa Fe Depot gave it up, and they slowly started selling off pieces. So if you go over there, you'll see 3 buildings that are now built in front of it, so you can't even see it anymore. So I think, and this building, even though it says 2025, I think it really started to die in 1971. And then in the early 1980s, when they built the racquetball facility and then another facility there, they sealed its fate. Now, the city acquired it back. RCTC acquired the property as part of their development of the rail station. And when they finished, they didn't know which side they were going to go on. They didn't know how they were going to construct it, and they kind of purchased all the property because it was all one piece. They sold it, to the city. The city at that point was interested in, redeveloping downtown and thought this would be some portion of it. And the city paid a pretty penny. I think it was about $600,000 for it. And then they couldn't figure out what to do with it. The city had, a downturn. Decided they were going to sell it at that point. Bob Zucco, the gentleman that owned the Corona Airport Cafe, had been running it for several years. He loved the building. Told the city, I can't pay $600,000. And they said, well, if you keep running it, we'll we'll see if we can get a valuation. And they got the valuation of $300,000. He mortgaged his home, and he sold the property, and he bought it from the city. And he ran it until his death, I think in, I want to say 2018 or 2019. And then employees and different folks had kind of run of the business. They had some legal issues, I think, in the late teens, but they were kind of able to come out of it. And then with COVID, it really knocked them down. And then the daughter inherited it. She lived in Idaho and really wasn't interested in the property. Tried to sell it back to the city. Said, "You guys we'll sell it to you." I said, "Great, what's the number? $3 million. That's funny. I go, "We sold it to your father for $300,000. You're going to sell it to us for $3 million." Okay. No, thank you. So we said no because there were two other offers of folks that really, one was they wanted to run a bar and restaurant, and the other one was not my favorite thing, but it was like a restaurant and hookah lounge kind of thing, and one that wanted to buy and one that wanted to lease, and we figured that one of those would come out on top. We did not know that Ganal was also interested in the property, and they came in with the strongest bid. Ganal knew that the property was a historic building. It's eligible for the National Register. The society paid a architectural historian to go and do a full write-up of the building, and it certainly qualified as both on the local, state, and national registers. But without the permission of the owner, you can't get those things listed. However, even without them, and if it was put on the register, it still was subject to the city ordinance for demolition. And that demolition said if you can't get all your money out of the building, you can't get the highest financial benefit, that the building can be torn down. So I'm hoping to change that. So I'm going to kind of go into buildings that we have lost, kinda. So they're still there, but they're substantially different. So the first one is the Corona Citrus Association. This was the second, right, Rich, the second or third? Second. First one was built sometime in the teens. I don't have the date, but it was shared in a railroad. There was a lot of fires. There was an arsonist that went around and apparently did not like packing houses, and he lit up 4 within about 6 months. 2 here in Corona, and I think 2 in Riverside. And they finally did catch him. And then it was a bunch of different businesses over the years. Served the community really well. Lots of folks have jobs there. In fact, if you go back and look at the society has a film from 1949 that Tom Richens and I do a little narrative of. You can see a color photo of people coming out of the building with some oranges or lemons in their hands, which is really cute. Just love all the way everybody was for us, but really cool. Became the Lucas Oil headquarters, their world headquarters in 1995. They also moved in their MAP TV, which is their motorsports television studios were there. Got a tour, it was really pretty. Down below was all their shipping and receiving, and then they moved to, in 2022, with all the changes in California, they decided enough was enough and went to Indiana, which is where their owner lived. So I'm going to throw in a couple of ones that probably you folks didn't think about. So the Desert Inn, which was the Cactus Garden Inn, which is just east of Lincoln. So this is a motel. They're motor hotels. Motor hotels there's a lot of them on 6th Street before the freeway came. Folks that were traveling through Corona to go to Riverside or to San Bernardino, they need a place to stay, and there was probably a dozen. So you think a small community like Corona at the time, 5 to 10,000 people, had I think almost 12 different motels. And this was one of the later ones that were built in this old style, but it's definitely it has the mid-century modern look to it. And this is from 1958 to 66. It was the Cactus Garden, and it became the Desert Inn. And this is what it looks like today. So still kind of the kitschy little piece to it. They've done a couple little flourishes that aren't necessarily accurate, like this second floor, even though it was there, it didn't have. They're confused. It's like it's mid-century modern, but then they put in arches like it's Michelin Revival. So they didn't quite figure it out. But but it's very cute. They've done a nice job with it, even though they replaced all the windows. I know Rich hates that. and so do I. But it's kind of really a really good example of that mid-century modern kind of look to it, and it's still there. And from what I understand, I did talk to the manager and the owner last week, and they love the building and they plan to take care of it for a long time, and it makes them money, so they like it. So the other one is the Flaming Arrow Motel. So probably not one we thought about. Wes is going to talk about the Flaming Arrow Motel on 6th Street today. But I found this postcard that shows the Flaming Arrow, and doesn't look like this now. The building's still the same, definitely mid-century modern motel feel to it. It does not look like this anymore. The pool's gone. They've filled it in. The rooms look like they probably haven't been touched since 1959. And I would not advise staying there. But it had a really cool sign. And there were a couple of signs that I remember when I came to Corona. This was one of them, and they had changed the sign a couple of times over the years. One that was really heavy neon, and definitely a throwback to that time frame. So you had that interesting. And so unfortunately, they changed to that sometime in the 80s, and they took out that sign and they just put a motel sign. So a sign is sometimes more than a sign. So on to the success stories. So preservation comes in all sizes. So this is the bare alignment and brake service. You see there's lots of rust. There was some of I think none of the neon was working. A couple of people had run into it. There were some dents and things, and they completely redid the building, or redid the sign completely. And the building has changed so much over the years that I don't even know what it would look like then, but they did a complete restoration of the sign, including the neon, and it's beautiful. They've done a great job with it, and they did it just because they love the sign. And the Bear system was pretty neat for the time. So 1952, there was a guy named Virgil Boyles that came up with this idea of how you would do alignments and brakes, and not as a money thing. Think about it, in the 1950s and 40s, these cars were overpowered, or they didn't have great brakes, and alignment really was a thing that they didn't know how to do it. So you're constantly fighting these vehicles, and he saw it really as a safety problem. So he did these trainings out in Indiana, and he would have people come and work for him for a little while, learn the system, and he would encourage them to open their own shops. And somebody asked him, I think sometime about 50 years later, boy, you should have done a franchise. And he said, why would I do that? I'm trying to give people a career. I'm trying to give them, so he basically let them use the name, he let them use the system, he let them use everything, and these things proliferated across the U.S. And one of the gentlemen that actually started the one here in Corona, he actually worked for Virgil, and came to Corona and built his own. And then there was one in Norco as well, and that gentleman, when he wanted to expand, he wanted to buy another Bear, so he ended up buying the one here in Corona. And he's the one that spearheaded the restoration of that sign. So preservation done right. So just a couple doors down, 711 West 6th Street. It was built in 1937 or so. I can't find the exact date. I need to go to the city and pull the permits, but it's this is what it looked like in the early 1990s, kind of run down. It looked like you could go anywhere. It was not a great place. Lots of police calls, lots of fire calls, lots of issues there. And then sometime, probably about 10 years ago, there was an extensive restoration that went through and really preserved. In fact, if you go on like apartments.com or one of the other, apartment places, you'll see they actually kept the feeling inside. So some of the showers and the bathrooms have that same feel to them from the 1930s. So this is what it looked like in 1987, 1988. No landscaping, bare ground, satellite dishes hanging out the wall, things are falling apart. The back of it looks like the windows are ready to fall out of it. Sorry, I apologize for the blurry pictures, but this is all I had. Looks really terrible, and this is what it looks like now. So they completely redid the windows. They redid the wrought iron, redid everything, and the plantings came out great. It's really a beautiful building, both inside and out. They kept the same windows. They didn't change them out for vinyl. They really were true to the design. And I just think it's absolutely a jewel. It kind of gets hidden behind it. There are two very large palm trees that kind of block it, and then if you're not really looking for it, you don't really see it, but it's a great location. And then, this is probably one of my favorites that people don't think about. This is the Bear Collision Service, opened in 1946 over on East Grand. It's currently owned by the German family. And so the story that Mark German, one of there's many Germans, tells me is that the building actually is tube framed. So if you walk in, it's actually got a tube framing throughout, and these boards that kind of hold it together. And the story that Mark tells me is that basically that this guy, when he built it, it wasn't a member of his family. It was a guy named Arthur Denton. Arthur lived in Riverside, but it sounded like his brother worked at one of the aluminum aircraft plants in Los Angeles. So they were building, B-17s and B-29s in Long Beach. At the end of the war, they have all this extra aluminum sheeting that's everywhere. Well, he says, hey, I got somewhere we could go. So he bought up all this aluminum sheeting and came down and built a tube frame and built it into what you see now. It's endangered. Right now, Mr. German's getting older. This would be a prime location for the size for housing. And the way it works right now is that this building isn't put on the landmark list or put on some kind of a list for the city, and if the rules aren't changed, this is a building that could go away tomorrow, unless the city wanted to buy it. Now, I hear that a lot. Have the city buy it. Have the city buy it. Well, the city has rules, so if the city buys it, if we sell it, we have to sell it to offer it to an affordable housing person first, and then if they don't want to buy it, then we can sell it to anybody we want. But the first thing is you have to offer it up for affordable housing, and that's a rule that we have. And the other part is the city. If the city retains it, we can only use it for a couple things: park, city facility, or housing. So those three things. So it ties our hands quite a bit. Next up, so we're our pancake house. I put a yellow on this one just because, though it was recently purchased, and thank you to the Fogels but this literally came within a week of being a Starbucks. The woman that owned it, her family had owned it since 1962, maybe a little bit before that. The Killingsworth family, they loved the building. They'd owned it for a long time. Her husband had a lot of affinity for it, and it had been the Pancake House since 1962. The current owners, the Hernandez family, they own this building, or they've run the business side of this since 1976. In fact, it was Robert's first job at 13 years old as a cook, and he later on in the 1990s was able to buy it from the guy who owned it back then, Roland Oscar. So Robert had first right of refusal for the building, but he literally couldn't come up with the money that they wanted for the building. Starbucks was the high bidder, and they said, we don't want the building, we're gonna knock the building down, and we want to build a drive-through. And Robert reached out to his friend Mark and said, Mark, would you be interested in helping me out? And he said, I'd love to, I love the building. But that doesn't mean, Mark's not gonna be around forever. So I'd really like to make sure this is one of these buildings I'd like to get on the local register to provide some protection for it going forward. And Mark's fine with that. He wants to make sure that he can, if he wants to paint it, that he's not going to, this isn't Pasadena or Santa Barbara where you have to have a certain style. I told him it's not like that. It's really just about preservation and having something be on the landmark list. You can get a property tax discount to 40%. So if you own one of these buildings, and we just expanded that to commercial buildings. Before it was just residential buildings, and now it's commercial buildings. I think it's another one. I think it started in 1953 as the Ice House. I think it was around as a tool company. I think before then I couldn't quite get the address because the address has changed on Grand in 1949, and then trying to juggle those numbers. But the Ice House was the business itself was owned by Tom Moffett for a long time. The Carroll or the Terry family, they owned it until I think the 60s. And then Tom took over the business, and I think he sold it to the current gentleman that has it now. But it's in rough shape. It definitely needs some help. Lots of rotting wood, lots of other things, but it's such a staple for folks that live in Corona, have lived in Corona, that they've gotten, lots of stories about where you could get ice and other things. And he originally started, working there, and he bought the building. He just had a tool sharpening shop in the back, and that's all he really wanted. And then when Tom got older, he said he wanted to get out of the business altogether, and he said, sure, why not? This is one of the ones that really surprised me. Corona Rose Flowers over on, just across the street here. This is one of the addresses that didn't change for some reason. I have no idea why. Same with the Silver Dollar didn't change. There were a couple other ones that just didn't change. But this started off as a market. In fact, several different markets. Andrews Market, it was probably 5 or 6 different markets, sometimes started in 1927. And then sometime in the 30s, it turned into the Tetley Nursery. And the Tetley Nursery, I kept thinking I got the wrong address. This is not a nursery. It was his offices. So this gentleman, he lived here in Corona, but he had ag interests all over the place. In fact, he did all of his hiring from here. So there was people that he would pick up in Corona, they would come here, he would take them to his farms that he had in Chino and Coima and like all over the place. So he also sold trees out of here. So if you look at the back of it, there was kind of a small area where he staged things. And then then at some point he split the building in half and had offices for rent. So if you look at the building, on one side you have glass block. I'm not quite sure when that happened. Maybe this side's a little bit different, but this building is much older than I thought. I thought it was literally from the 40s just based on its design, but maybe the facades. But this building is definitely from 1927. And then kind of catty corner on the other side of Buena Vista is the old Crown Back store. It had been a lot of different things. Started off as an electrical supply company. It was a electrical repair company. It always had something to do with appliances. They did some storage in the back. Right now I put green because the city owns it, though the city did vote to tear it down. We were able to bring in a consultant to say, hey, there aren't too many old buildings like this, you probably shouldn't tear them down. So the city management changed their mind, and now it's on the green spot for now, but that could change. I mean, it's got a lot of original features to it. The windows, of course, have been changed, but the brick is all original, and the pilasters are just covered because there's brick underneath them. And then probably one of my favorite buildings, the arcade building, was, let's see, it's 815 South Main. It started off as built by a gentleman named Fay Gregg, and Fay was a real estate agent in town, sold a lot of houses, a lot. In fact, I would say him and a gentleman named Harry Slayton, and Harry had a business that was basically just down the street as well, where the kind of Rogers Rush glass was, and he had kind of this like kitschy looking little building, and he tore that down and built what is there now. But this building is it's really cool. It's kind of this idea, it was built, started in 1949. It was built, finished in 1949. I think it took him 3 months to build it, even with all the glass and everything else. And it's a beautiful building. And his idea was to make sure that he had a place that he could work. And one of his first lessees was Rudy Ramos. So that building, or the studio right across, was Rudy Ramos's photography studio.
Well, isn't that where Watkins Pharmacy?
Yes.
Because I came in 72, and that's all I ever knew.
Yep. Yeah.
Now it's
Yeah.
a mortuary.
And I'm worked as a dental hygienist in the very back of the building, doing
Yeah.
medical and dental office.
Yeah, I think there's seven offices, or seven, yes, sir. I know you might know a little bit about this,
Having grown up.
Mr. Lockman.
So that real estate building, and then I think right behind it, right there in front was Chamber of Commerce.
Yep, Chamber of Commerce.
And then my dad opened up pharmacy in front, which says real estate. He, at that time, it was owned by Jack Sherman, and the Rexall Pharmacy further down. Later on, building. The studio later, that became a number of doctors' offices. There's Dr. Gill's, somebody else, I think. Dr. Gano and his partner originally were in the studio after Rudy left. And then he ended up a chiropractor in there and a beauty shop. So there was a Corona travel agency that was originally as well. And that was the second one in on that. And later on, my dad bought that side and opened up as a double. And after he left, that became
Yeah, this is one of those buildings I've always loved in Corona. I just find it really indicative of that time frame. And like I said, I just love it. And this is one of my favorite pictures because you can really pick out the arcade building sign and it's still there. And this is what it looks like today. And I included these just because I think there's some cultural aspects to them. So we did talk about McGill's Jr. celebrating their 50th anniversary, yesterday, even though it was March 28th of 1975 that they opened in that location. They were the third business there. First business was called Taco Flats, which apparently folks in Corona, and this was a small chain. I think they had like 3 or 4 locations. And apparently people didn't know what a tostada was, but they called them a flat. Taco Flat, I don't know. Anyway, it didn't last very long. They were only around for about 4 years and then became Wacky Taco. Apparently that didn't go very well either. They were advertising, basically they were half-price tacos and new management every couple of months, and then Miguel's purchased it, and it looks like January of 1975. And if you think about it, they had just opened the Miguel Senior in the west side of town, 1973. They opened in July of 1973, and literally 18 to 20 months later, they dive into something that's not even the same. I mean, they're doing a fast food, and what a serendipitous chance to do it. But talk about entrepreneurship and taking a chance on yourself. And these are two people. I know that, my family grew up with the Vasquez family. My brother and Mike Vasquez were, basically inseparable. When we would go to eat there, Javier, the current CEO, would come by and steal our check, and he was like 6 years old. He'd take the check and go give it to his mom. And Mike never graduated high school. In fact, Mike never went beyond the 3rd grade. His education, he went to work in the fields, and he was a hard worker. He was a mason. In fact, if you go to the beautiful home they built up on Orange Heights, he either worked on every single piece of that home or built parts of it himself. He was that kind of guy. He wouldn't stop. And in fact, pretty famously, if you look back in some of the social media for the school district, Maria went back and got her high school diploma. She just turned, I think, 82. And just a few months ago. So pretty impressive family, and pretty impressive from an entrepreneur standpoint. And the other one, the Budget King, courtesy Del Rey. I think it's one of those things where, people have been buying, meat there. I've been buying my meat there for years. It definitely has a cultural feel to it. And the interesting part was the Taco Flats restaurant and Carne Del Rey restaurant, they were actually built the same month in 1968 by the same builder. Yes, sir.
Was that on 6th Street or on 5th?
On 6th. Yeah, so they were actually built, they were advertised in the same advertisement for a building permit. They were done at the same time by the same builder. And not anything like each other, but I think there's some cultural standpoint that, especially as Miguel starts to get bigger, and the Carnicia there is one of the only remaining. I'm trying to think of. There are, I think the liquor store, and there might be a couple of others that have been there a little bit longer, but there aren't too many other places that are still the same from the 60s. Okay. And then last but not least, the Corona Theater. Talk about, this is iconic. If you look throughout the city and new buildings that were built in the last 30 years, they all have that tower. And that's all part of what the city has called a Corona aesthetic. And that Corona aesthetic is basically centered in this building. It was built in 1928. It's currently used as a church and daycare for the folks there. They take pretty good care of it. But it was, at one point, the second floor was a Masonic temple. They met there, I think when it was first built. Like, I have some drawings of the inside, but there was 4 or 5 different businesses, including the gas company. I think John Ganal was a local attorney. He had his office there for a while. Insurance agents. It was as I said at the beginning of the presentation, this was really the one of Corona's strip malls. So they built this building and had all these little businesses that were in it. But yeah, one of my favorite buildings, and that's kind of the obvious one, but it's one that literally the way that the rules are written right now, that if the developer was to purchase this building and say that, I'd really like to build apartments there, the city could say, okay, no, we're not going to rezone it. Or he'll say, okay, well, I can build apartments within the current facility, we'll keep this the same, blah, blah, blah. And then later on down the road, after they get their zone change, they say, you know what, it's not profitable, we can't build it that way, we're just going to need to knock the thing down. The option would be the city would have to buy it and then have to offer it to affordable housing. So, like I said, looking to get that changed. So, there are a lot of businesses a lot of buildings that I did not mention. In fact, I even thought up probably 4 or 5 more as I was talking, but first one, Joy Street Market over on Joy Street, it started in 1937. The Subway or Safeway and U-Haul on West 6th Street, you can still kind of see the grocery store version. La Casa Furniture, which is right across the street from the Silver Dollar, was called Henrique's, and he was Rocco was the owner there, and he kind of bought the Pancake House and turned it from Jane's Fine Foods into Lindy's. He also owned the Airport Cafe, not the one that you would think about. There was another airport that was a 6th in Magnolia. There was another airport that was there. Dip Clay Mercury, Bell's Auto, that building is still there. Anything you see with an asterisk, the building is still there and it looks kind of the same. That was 1950. The Rogers Rush Block, just down the street on West 6th Street, that's still there. Alpha Beta, Alfie's, Honey's, that building is still there. It's been reskinned, of course, a bunch of times, but the building itself is still there. And then Hatton's Tri-County Eye Institute, that's over on Grand and Main. It's still, if you see pictures of the old building, you can still see the building there, and they have some false windows where there used to be windows. But it was interesting, I found out that Mr. Hatton, which it's funny that he's Manhattan Market, I have no idea why, but it was originally a gas station. And he had a gas station there, and he had a little market, and he sold vegetables, and then he turned it into Manhattan's Market, and then later on became Hatton's Market. Just took off the man, I have no idea why, I just thought it sounded better. And he had the spelling different too. And then of course, the Lemon Products Exchange over in Joy and Grand, not there anymore, of course. The Pig and the Ray Aparicio Tax Service. Talked a little bit about it earlier. The building is still there, but it's substantially different. You see the pictures, you can't tell. Blandy's Market, not there, over that was on Main Street between 3rd and 4th. Sun's Auto, which was Cropper Ford, that's over on West 6th Street. The building is pretty much the same. They haven't changed any of the dimensions. It's all still there. It still has that kind of, it started in 1935. That building is gone. 1950s version of that building is still, 50s building is still there. And then For the People Task Force, which is basically right across from the car wash. That actually was James Motors. And they sold used cars, some Pontiacs a little bit. But that building is, and I think later on, it was an auto parts store, Western Auto, I think at some point. But I have some pictures of that from 1946 that are just absolutely incredible. Again, you can still see the building is still there, substantially still there. And then the one I just found not that long ago is there's some workforce housing that was built in the 1920s. And if you're on West 6th Street, and you're going down West 6th Street on the right-hand side, you'll see some Adobe-looking buildings on Fuller and 6th. So kind of not quite to Grand yet. And you'll see it, and there's a picture that Tom Richens posted, an aerial photograph from about 1928. And you can pick it out clear as day. There are these 16 very white, white-colored Adobes that are there, and they're exactly the same. They're still there. And that's it. So where we come to is where I need all of your help. I need to nominate these buildings. Anybody from the public, we just changed the rules. So if you see a building that you think should be on the local list, you can nominate it. It doesn't take a lot. You can connect with me or any member of our board. If you see a building that's worthy, we'll try and find a way to go talk to the owner, and you don't need the owner's permission to at least get it acknowledged on the list, but that's at the start. And the other thing is, and I mentioned earlier about pictures. I love pictures. The library has some great pictures. In fact, probably half of the pictures I use today are from the library, but there are so many more. And I tell people, you probably have pictures if you've been in Corona very long, you probably have pictures of buildings, you probably have pictures, I know your family's probably in the foreground, but there's probably some really great pictures. I'd love to have those. It provides a real documentation of what Corona was and could still be, and getting those given to either the library, you can connect through us, it's fine. The library will take all those pictures. They'll scan them and give them back to you. They don't need the hard copies. If you want to get the hard copies, that's fine. But they have a scanning up there. We've expanded the Heritage Room. If you haven't been in the Heritage Room lately, it is not just a sterile room where you have to go and ask for things. It's literally interactive. You can go and pull files yourself. You can ask the clerk there to help you with things. It's absolutely amazing. They have you can bring in VHS and they'll digitize it for you for free. If you have old reel-to-reel, they'll do that, and they'll put it in digital format for you for free, as long as you bring your own recording device. If you want to scan photos, you can scan them there, all for free. So that's my two asks. And I didn't talk about this earlier, but the Mills Act is it's a tax rebate program that the state and county works in with the city and the property owner. And it used to be only the best of the best buildings were nominated for the Mills Act. And we added another category called the structure of merit. So if a building could literally have some repair to it to become better, changing out windows, you'd submit a work list to the city and provide a list of what you would do over the next 10 years to bring that property up to to where it would be, or even say, it doesn't have to be in the first 10 years, maybe it's in the second 10 years. But you can work on getting that property up, and it helps protect it. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't do anything with your property. It just means that we're going to help you preserve it if that's what you want to do. So it's really, really important. So before I leave you, I know Mary will yell at me if I don't, but if you aren't a member, we'd love for you to join us. There's one of our newsletters over here in the very back of it is how you can join. You can go on our website. You can join that way. I hope you guys enjoyed this. So I have two little special fun slides at the end here, and I'm going to give you guys a second if you'll figure out where this is.
Right here.
Right here.
Look familiar?
Yeah, that's city manager's office.
So I'm right there.
Oh my gosh. Oh.
So if you look around, this is this building. This is probably, just based on the furniture, I'm thinking 1960s. It wasn't dated, but that's the way that this room looked.
Look at the ash trees. Are those ash trees?
They are.
Oh my gosh.
Of course. Become a nice home. So I just thought this was a really cute picture. And then if you turn around, that's looking in the other direction. So the city manager's office was in the corner here. I've been described to me many times. It's the first time I've actually ever seen it. But all I think of when I walk over there is, oh my gosh, it's so loud in there. But, so yeah, so you get an idea of what this room used to look like. The city's done a pretty good job of, I think when it was the high school, it was the
Library.
the library, so I just thought those were two fun.
And that's where they would check out the books, right over there.
Yeah. All right, that's it. Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. You guys.
Thank you.